All right, picking up where we left off last day. This will be Awesome Angle Lesson Part 2. Give it a nice title here. Awesome Angle Lesson Part 2. Lesson. Notes. There we go. Okay, now, pretty short lesson here. It's a big idea we got to get across here. Not very difficult, but we do need to see it all through. And then not very many questions for homework, because it's just a big idea you have to see. What I want to talk about is parallel lines and the angles that come out of parallel lines. And all of this is actually fairly intuitive. But again, got to see it once. So say I've got two parallel lines. And it's nice, I got this line paper here. I can draw two nice parallel lines. I'm going to draw this diagram pretty big so I got room to write on it. And then, if those two lines are parallel, we'll put little arrows on them, and that indicates that those lines are parallel, which means they go in the exact same direction. They never get any closer to each other. They never get any farther away from each other. Perfectly parallel. Now, if we have another straight line that cuts through those two parallel lines, it has a specific name that we need to know, called a transversal. That name can come up once in a while, so it's worth memorizing that name there, transversal. But what I want to tell you is that if you then measure the angles in this diagram, you'd find a very, very distinct pattern to the angles. Now, I haven't tried to draw this to scale. We never try and draw angle pictures to scale. So when I write an angle on here, it doesn't mean I've measured it with my protractor. I'm just saying, let's say this angle here was 110 degrees. Because these lines are parallel, we now actually know every other angle in the picture. For instance, because this line right here is a straight line, the angle on the other side of that straight line, that'll be a 70, because those two angles have to add to 180. And then if I do the same thing, continue to go counterclockwise there, I get this one is 110 degrees. And then I get this one is 70 degrees. And that's not how some people remember it. They just go, oh, in an X like that, opposite angles are equal. And I'll get to that in a second, because some teachers and some people like these letters to indicate. The first letter that we, in the patterns we look at is the letter X. And when you have a letter X with angles, we know these two angles are equal. And we know these two angles are equal. And we know A plus B has to be 180. Those two angles have to add to 180. Okay, but anyways, back to parallel lines. Now, if these lines meet at parallel lines, that means the line that's transversal is going to meet the first line at the exact same angles it meets the second line. The two lines are going in the exact same direction. It's got to meet the line in the exact same angles. If it's a straight line, I mean, I drew mine pretty straight here, but if we're talking about a straight line, we'll get the same angle pattern here. So we'll get 110, we'll get 70, we'll get 110, we'll get 70, exact same things all the way around there. So that's what's really nice about parallel lines, is that once you have one angle of the 8, you get them all. You sort of get a payoff there. Now, there are some other letters that teachers use often to be able to indicate what's going on with parallel lines. For instance, now that we have these parallel lines, we can set up a Z pattern. Very, very common to see the Z pattern. And when we see a Z pattern like this, that means that this angle and this angle inside the Z have to be the same. Can you see the Z pattern in that picture? I'll draw it on there very quickly. Here comes the Z pattern. I'm going to use all the colors here to draw these letters. Whoops, that's not a highlighter. Highlighter. And I'll use yellow first of all. There's the Z pattern. Do you see it there? You can get a reverse Z too, but nice Z pattern. They're both 70 in there. Another angle pattern that comes out of there is called C pattern. And when you get C pattern in parallel lines, these two inner angles, they're not equal. They add to 180 degrees. They're not the same angle that are in there. So that's the, in the C pattern in the picture there, you can see, I'll do it in orange there. There's the C pattern. You see it's 110 and 70 there. So they are actually supplementary angles when you get C pattern. And the last letter you'll see sometimes is the F pattern. That's when the parallel lines are like this. And what you'll find is these two letters inside the F are equal to each other. And where's the F in this pattern? Now I'll draw it in another color, what I haven't used, green. There's the F in the picture there. And you see the 110 and the 110 on the insides of those letter F's, those obtuse angles are both equal. And those are very handy letters to remember because they just remind you about the patterns that go on with parallel lines. Okay, well, what type of questions are you going to see? Well, I'm going to do one tough one and one easy one. So example 1. You might see a picture like this where they go, okay, we want parallel lines, and just to make it different than the previous question, I'll make the transversal sort of come at it the other way, and they'll say these things are parallel. Sometimes they use one arrow, sometimes they use 2 arrows, and maybe they give you this angle in here. And they want to know, say, this angle over here. And there's lots of ways of going about this. Once you've got parallel lines, there's lots of ways you can handle it. One way, a very fascinating way, is to write this Z pattern here, and I can see already that X is 114. And not everybody would do it that way, I don't think. Some people would go, okay, if that one's 114, then I've got sort of reverse F. So this one down here is 114, so then X is 114. So that's one type of question. Now, let's say they even wanted this one over here, Y over here. Then I go, oh, okay, well, Y is 180 minus the 114, so Y is 66 degrees, okay? So that's like level 1 parallel lines. Pretty straightforward stuff. How can I make it more complicated? How can I make a parallel line question with just a little more torque to it? Let's just add some other angles into the whole picture there to make things just a little more wild for you when you're doing ones like this, okay? So maybe something, I want to have 2 parallel lines. Like that. And a nice transversal. But maybe what I've got sticking out of this is, some kind of triangle situation involved. That's an interesting situation, is to put a triangle into this big mess here and sort of complicate the issue so that what happens is in your brain that the angles all sort of flip in together, so it's difficult to pick out all the different angles that are going on there. And so you might see something where you have to really stare at it and really think through all the different angles you're seeing so that you can pick out the patterns and the information that they've given you to try and come up with this information that they've outlined there. So maybe I've got like a triangle like this, and then a triangle like that, and those are parallel like that, and they say something like this. They say, okay, they give you this angle 57 degrees, and then they give you this angle 68 degrees, right? And then they want to know, X way over here. And then they give you this one, which is 84 degrees. Okay, so they give you those angles, and they want to know X up there. Now, it's oftentimes people will look at a problem like this, and they'll go, oh, well, how am I supposed to figure out X? Well, that's one way to solve this problem, is to go, I need a plan to get X. And that is one good way to do it. An optional plan to that is go, well, you know what? I'll get to X. I'm just going to look at the situation and think about the angle properties I know and see if I can come up with other angles in the situation. And if I can do that, then maybe I can move towards getting this X value. So the first one that comes to mind from last day's lesson is there's a triangle at the bottom here. So maybe I could go after this one here. And it doesn't have a name, so I'm going to give it a name of A. And I'm going to try and solve for what A is. I'm going to go, okay, A is 180, subtract the 68, subtract the 57. And if I blast that all into my calculator, 180 subtract 68, subtract 57, then I can get the A value 55. And as I mentioned last day, once you find an angle in a question like this, I encourage you to write it on your picture because it really helps to visualize what's happening, okay? And so you're like, well, that didn't really help me move towards X. All I did was find another angle in the picture. Well, what's weird about questions like this is that actually does help. Any angle you can get in the picture actually does move things forward. So maybe then you go, well, I can see this is all a straight line here, so I'm going to label this angle B, and I'm going to say, well, that's all a straight line there, so I know those 3 angles have to add to 180. So again, I go, okay, so B is the 180. Sometimes if you have trouble seeing the straight lines, a little highlighter helps. There's the straight line I'm talking about. B is 180, subtract the 84, subtract the 68. So 180, subtract the 64, the 84, whoops, careful. subtract the 68, and I get 28 degrees in there. And like I said, I'm going to put the angle on there. Every time I solve for an angle, I'm going to put it on there. Well, then you sort of hit a standstill. You're like, well, that's fine, but I still can't get towards x. What I really want to know is, and this is, I'm going to switch over to yellow here. I'd really love to know that angle in there. But take a look. There's a little C pattern going on here, and maybe you see you're going to go and treat this like an F somehow as well. You can do that. Now, let me just draw in. I'll use orange here. Right here is this C pattern with the parallel lines, and so I can find out that angle in there. I'm going to give it a name. I'm going to call it C, because I'm using C pattern here maybe. And I'm going to go, okay, that means C plus the 55 way down at the bottom of this orange C there, that has to add to 180. And so now I can solve for C. C is 180 minus 55. I get C is 125 degrees. And I'll write that on my picture. You see, I never really had a plan here, except find angles. Use the things I know to find some angles. And now I can finally find x, because it's all in a triangle up there, and I can go x equals 180, subtract the 125, subtract the 28. Stick to my pattern of writing the degree symbols in the first line here to make sure I'm keeping track of all that. And then you go to your calculator and go, okay, 180 minus the 125 minus the 28, and bang, x is 27 degrees. When it's all done, I've got that x value of 27 degrees. And some of the homework questions, instead of just solving for 1x, they might ask you for different values. Like they might say, okay, well, we also want to know like y over here. And you might have to use something to solve for y and go, okay, well, I see that's opposite to the a, and so I'm going to go y equals 55 degrees. That one's an easy enough question. But sometimes they want multiple letters. But don't get discouraged. Like just go, okay, what can I find? Don't get too excited about making a whole plan, because you don't always need to do that. All right, that's it. Pretty short lesson here. Quick parallel line stuff. Work through that homework.